I want to start with your headline. You say that the pre-pandemic economy isn't coming back ever. So what about the new economy will be different forever going forward, in your view?
Well, some things really need to change because people talk about post-COVID getting back to normal, but the reality is normal didn't work for a lot of people. I mean, 6 months, 12 months ago, we were talking about how we need to have a more inclusive innovation economy, not just backing entrepreneurs in places like Silicon Valley, but all over the country. We talked about needing to make sure people from every walk of life had an opportunity if they have an idea. Women, for example, last year got less than 10% of venture capital, represent half of our country. African Americans, Black founders get less than 1% of venture capital, even though it's 13% of the population. So as we think about this, of course, we need to be focused on recovery and reopening and so forth, but we really need to imagine a new economy that works for more people in more places. And that's what I hope Congress will now focus on. They did the right things to stabilize the existing businesses, the PPP program, things like that. It was an important start, almost like triage in the emergency room. But now we need to focus on getting moving forward and making sure that we have an economy that we can be proud of that really does bring everybody along. And that's what I think this phase 4 legislation should focus on.
Now, you've traveled the country looking at entrepreneurship trends, and I'm curious just how many or how vast you think the failure of small and medium businesses across the country will be as we go into a second wave of the virus. And some of these businesses that have been trying to hang on through the first wave say they just can't hold on for another few months.
Yeah, I think it's going to be tough. But even without COVID, a lot of businesses go under every year. There's a this kind of creative destruction process, which is why it's so important to be planting the seeds of the new companies, some of which will emerge to replace some of those jobs that inevitably will be lost. I think because of COVID, we'll see even more of that over the next year. And there's only two ways to approach it. Either the government steps in and says we're going to provide more support money for the communities that are struggling, the people that are struggling, and that is part of the solution. Or there's a focus on how do you launch those new companies to create those new jobs, not just focus on the rearview mirror on the existing companies, sort of almost the industries of the past, focus on the new companies, the startups that can help create the industries of the future and do it all over the country, not just in a few places like Silicon Valley. So that's what my hope will happen here, that there will be not just a return to normal, but an opportunity to create a stronger economy that really is more inclusive.
So you're asking for Congress to sort of prioritize smaller startups in terms of the businesses that are getting funding. And I wonder, how does Congress identify, or how does the U.S. government identify who qualifies? I mean, as we both know, there are plenty of small startups with big ideas that make big promises, and they don't deliver. And even, very intelligent venture capitalists who are working on this every day miss the big opportunities. So how does the U.S. government then decide who to give money to and who to essentially leave behind?
Well, for starters, I don't think the role of the government is to be investing directly in companies, trying to pick winners and losers. So as much as they did with the PPP program, in putting capital behind banks that could make lending decisions, some of those lending decisions should be based on what jobs can be created in the future, and that can be tracked. And the forgivability of the loans will be partly tied to how many jobs are in fact created in a sustained kind of way. Similarly, there's been legislation introduced now 4 months ago by Senator Klobuchar and others to really provide from the Treasury some support for regional venture capital firms with a particularly bias to more inclusive entrepreneurship. So there are existing ideas out there. We just need Congress not just to focus on the past, but focus on the future, not just focus on small business, however important they may be, but focus on these new businesses because they're the big job creators. Big business, Fortune 500, does not create a lot of jobs as a sector. Small business, however important it is, does not create a lot of jobs as a sector. The new companies, the startups, are really where the focus needs to be. And by the way, it's not just tech startups. Startups all across our economy, healthcare, food and agriculture. There's real opportunities to really back the next generation of entrepreneurs. We just need to do it everywhere, not just in a few places, and need to include everybody, not just a few people.
So I'm curious then, where are you putting your money to work at this time with Revolution? Like, where do you see those opportunities, especially as we see this potentially tectonic shift in how and where we work and what we essentially need to do our jobs?
Well, Revolution has three parts: Revolution Growth, Revolution Ventures, and the Rise of the Rest is Seed Fund, where I spend a lot of time is on the Revolution Growth kind of later stage investments. We're doing a lot of things in the healthcare space, a company called Tempest in Chicago is doing extremely well using big data to provide a better way to think about oncology. We backed a company called Scopely, had enormous success around mobile gaming. We're seeing a lot of traction in that space. We've backed companies in the food sector, including Sweet Green, a fast casual concept that's doing extraordinarily well. They obviously had to shut down their restaurants, but they accelerated their efforts around delivery and pickup, and they're expanded their menu. We've done some things in e-learning. A company called Echo 360, we invested in Workspace, a company called Convene that has repositioned because their core business obviously had to be shut down to figure out how to do virtual meetings and hybrid meetings where some people will be in the room, some people will be virtual, just as some people will be working from office, other people will be virtual. So we're seeing enormous innovation happening from great entrepreneurs trying to reimagine what the future might look like. And so we're excited about the future across all of the aspects of Revolution. But there are some of the examples from Revolution Growth that are really showing enormous momentum. Lastly, I should say we've invested in a number of sports tech companies. Ted Leonsis, as you know, is a partner of mine. Worked together now for 3 decades. DraftKings was an investment. As you saw a couple months ago, they went public. Sport Radar is another company in the data analytics space. So amazing companies that we've had the real privilege of backing.
Curious then, since you mentioned that, what is your outlook given the uncertain return of professional sports for the sports industry in general?
Well, Ted is the expert on that, so you probably should ask him. I think it will be a slow recovery. Obviously, you see some of the leagues already reopening. The amazing thing to me is a company like DraftKings, because the leagues were shut down and they really rely on them, was still able to do a very successful offering, in part because people did see how the future would play out and how a company like DraftKings would become more important, going forward. But I think it'll take some time. I also am the chair of the Smithsonian. We're in the process now of starting to reopen some of the museums. The first couple open on Friday. We'll slowly open the others, but we'll have to keep an eye on it because it may be a situation where, if you've seen in other countries, sometimes you open but then have to close again. So I think we're not out of the woods for sure with COVID. I think there is a real risk of a serious second wave, but we'll get through this as a country. I just hope, which goes back to the main point of the op-ed, we get through this and really have a stronger economy that really is working for more people in more places. And that's why I'm urging Congress to really focus this time not on existing businesses, but new businesses, and have some of the legislative focus in phase 4 on startups.
Meantime, as you're advocating here for the government to support smaller businesses, you've got Congress scrutinizing the biggest tech companies in the world, the CEOs of Apple, Google, Amazon, Facebook, all scheduled to testify on Capitol Hill on Monday. I mean, as somebody who built an enormous technology company, what is your take on this? I mean, do these companies present a good case for being broken up?
Well, I think each of them has a little bit different story, and I'll let them tell their story. But I'm not surprised there's more of a scrutiny of these big tech companies. I'm also not surprised there's more of a backlash, what some have called a techlash. I actually wrote a book 4 years ago called The Third Wave, and talked about how in this third wave, the internet policy was going to become more important, more regulatory issues were going to become more important. So I think we're now seeing that play out. Facebook obviously is the most visible company now with some consumers, but also a lot of advertisers kind of backing away from it. Hopefully they'll use this as an opportunity to take a step back and rethink some of their policies so they can build on what is an extraordinary success, an extraordinarily powerful platform, but also make sure they're doing things that are constructive, not destructive for society. So I'm not surprised by the scrutiny. It'll be interesting to see what happens when they all come to Washington. Hopefully that will be not just a one-off event, but an ongoing effort to educate policymakers on what they're doing and why they're doing it. I think we need much more of that constructive dialogue between places like Silicon Valley and Washington, D.C., Brussels, other parts around the world. This third wave is going to be complicated. Policy is going to be front and center because it's critical to healthcare, it's critical to smart cities, it's critical to many of the opportunities to really innovate. So we're going to have much more of a dialogue between the innovators and the policymakers.
On that note, I know you're an investor in Talkspace. Oren, the CEO, was on our show when he pulled out of a potentially huge partnership with Facebook for this very reason, that he didn't support the decisions that Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg were making about speech on the platform and decisions about President Trump's speech in particular. In those cases, do you think that Facebook is making the right call?
No, I don't. And when Talkspace announced they're pulling back, I supported their decision. And hurt their business because the Facebook partnership certainly could have been important. Hopefully, it'll be offset by others really rallying around the company and supporting what they're trying to do around digital mental health, because it's an important problem as a society we need to solve. I think the fact that now hundreds and hundreds of companies have joined Talkspace and pulling out their advertising off Facebook, hopefully, is a wake-up call that I think the company needed. And I would imagine they are reassessing things, and hopefully in the weeks and months ahead, maybe there'll even be some announcement the next week with Congress that they'll be a little more forward about trying to make sure they manage their platform in a responsible way.
So what do you think Facebook should be doing differently? I mean, do you think that Facebook should be flagging these posts by President Trump that seem to be advocating violence on the American people?
Well, I'm not going to get into the specifics because I don't have all the facts that Facebook has. They took some initial efforts to put together a group to review some content. I think that was a step in the right direction, but they need to continue to look at ways to iterate this. I obviously dealt with this 25 years ago when AOL was the leading service in the country, and we actually dealt with a lot of these issues in terms of speech, and even had the first litigation around this rule called the 230 rule. So I understand the complexity, understand the subtlety of it. I don't think just having kind of quick answers with limited facts is the way to proceed. But clearly there's a lot of people, and it's not even a Republican or Democratic issue. It's not just a business versus government issue. There's a lot of people that really think, while they respect Facebook and what they've done, they really think it's time to take a step back and do some things differently. Other platforms such as Twitter has begun to be more active in that space, and I think they're shouldering the responsibility you have when you're leading a company that has such a profound impact on our everyday lives.
Meantime, AOL was always based closer to Washington, and I wonder if you think that some of these newer generation tech companies could be doing a better job managing that relationship, because it certainly seems like the scrutiny isn't going away anytime soon. I know Amazon has been working towards a second headquarters in your neck of the woods in Northern Virginia, close to AOL's old neighborhood. Who knows how quickly that will develop, given this trend towards working from home. But I wonder what your outlook is on the general relationship of these companies with the White House, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat in office.
Well, I think it's going to become much more important. Again, when I wrote the book, The Third Wave, I talked about the first wave, and companies like AOL and others were building the internet, building the on-ramps, getting people connected. Policy was front and center. When we started AOL 35 years ago this summer, it actually was illegal for consumers or businesses to be on the internet. It was still restricted to government use and educational institution use. So that had to change. All the issues around tax policy for e-commerce had to be kind of worked out. So policy was front and center. The second wave, when it was about software and apps, services riding on top of the internet, Facebook and Google and other things, policy was not that important until the companies got really large and started having a kind of outsized influence. In the third wave, when the internet really kind of meets everyday life and it really changes healthcare and food agriculture systems and smart cities and financial services and education, all kinds of different things that are going to be pretty fundamental changes in our everyday life and pretty disruptive to big sectors of our economy, policy, regulatory issues are going to become important again. And innovators don't like to hear that, but the reality is we as people do want somebody to make sure the drugs that we're taking or the medical devices that we're using are safe. We do want to make sure that while drones and other kind of technologies can be super helpful, that they don't create harmful impacts in terms of privacy or other kinds of things. So policy is becoming more important. It's only going to increase in the next 10 years. The critical challenge is to make sure the innovators and the policymakers really are having that dialogue, so the policymakers don't overly regulate, stifle what might be possible, or the innovators don't overreach and create problems, including around kind of big brother privacy sorts of issues. It's going to be tricky, but we're only going to get to the right place if we have a constructive dialogue with both sides. Hopefully, the discussions now happening, that even though they may be focused more on a few big companies and antitrust kind of issues, hopefully that leads the way towards a much more engaging and consistent dialogue around how to drive innovation to make sure the United States remains the most innovative entrepreneurial nation in the world as we move into this third wave and deal with all the implications of it. And hopefully, going back to what I said at the beginning, we also can do that in a much more inclusive way so that people in all over the country who have ideas can access the capital to start and scale those businesses, create jobs in those communities, so people in those communities have more reason to be hopeful and optimistic about the future. There's a lot of work that can be done as we move beyond rebuilding to reimagining to create a new kind of capitalism, a new kind of more inclusive innovation economy, and really lead the way, hopefully, as a nation in this third wave of the internet.